You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinec.hu/en.
Hello and welcome to the MCC podcast. I'm Luke Larson, visiting fellow here at the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, and I'm joined today by Saurabh Sharma. He's the president of American Moment, the host of the Moment of Truth podcast, former state chairman of the Young Conservatives of Texas, and graduated from the University of Texas at Austin in 2019. And he's here in Hungary for his very first time. Welcome to the show, Saurabh.
It's my pleasure. Another thing that might not be in my formal bio yet is I'm also the executive director of the Edmund Burke Foundation, which puts on national conservatism conferences.
Okay, very good. And Speaking of the National Conservatism Conference, we met each other briefly for the first time this week at the National Conservatism Conference in Brussels, which I think was a much more impactful event than any of us at the conference would have expected. Of course, the local government in Brussels tried to shut it down, calling it a far-right gathering that would disturb the public order. So what was your experience of that incident, Saurabh, and do you have any takeaways from that?
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun. My poor mother, she texted me, "What is going on?" after the first day, because I think she saw some pictures of police officers, and I said, "Oh, I just caused a minor international incident." 4 prime ministers have commented on this. It's fine. Everything's fine. For the audience, basically what happened is that we had been planning NatCon Brussels 2 for a few months now. The idea was preserving the nation state in Europe would be the subtitle. You have elections coming up here on the continent that are going to determine whether Europe is a continent of independent nations, each charting their own path, or a totalitarian NGOcracy hosted in Brussels. And so we had hosted a conference in Brussels before at this venue called Concert Noble, and we were going to again. And then last week, Concert Noble pulled out all of a sudden, and we were left scrambling. And then we found a second venue Monday, and they pulled out as well. And we were freaking out, and we realized what happened is that the Brussels mayor had been putting pressure on these venues to pull out. And he had sort of 2 sets of reasons that overlap somewhat for why he's doing it. The Brussels mayor is a socialist, obviously. He said that because of the Antifa protests that he couldn't guarantee public safety, but that also, these are homophobes and traditionalists and Eurosceptics at this conference, so it's really for their own good that they not be allowed to gather. Just the most Orwellian garbage, frankly. And so we end up scrambling and find a third venue last second, owned by a Tunisian Muslim immigrant, no less, in Brussels, and we host the conference, and I am on stage hosting a panel, and I start getting text messages from my colleagues, and they're saying, "The police are coming to shut this event down." I was like, "Oh, that's terrible." I guess let's continue the panel. And we do. And at one point, 3 police officers, they tell people at the door, they're like, "This event is canceled." And I think they expected us to just file out of there as good little soldiers. But we didn't do that. And so eventually they come in, and they look around, and they see the big crowd, they see the cameras, and they look at the organizers, and they're like, "We're not going to play this game." And they leave. And they just stand outside. And the goal they ended up setting was that they're going to use a war of attrition against the conference. Anyone can leave, but they can't come back in. Well, you were there. A lot of people just decided to stay. And so we continued the conference that day undeterred. Somehow Cardinal Mueller and MP Miriam Cates found their way in. Wonder how that happened. There must have been some funny business with a back door or something. Hard to say. But we ended up having the conference that day. And then late Wednesday night, there was a court order from a Belgian court that said that the mayor was not allowed to shut this down the next day. And so we finished out the conference undeterred. Everyone had a fantastic time. National conservative ideas were spread way more than they would have otherwise because the Brussels mayor decided to cause an international incident. 4 different prime ministers ended up commenting on it. You had U.S. senators and congressmen commenting on it. It became quite a brouhaha. Still digesting all of it, but proof positive, I think, of the original thesis, which is if you let these people in Brussels run this entire continent, a conservative will not be safe in any capital, in any city, in any small town. in all of Europe.
Mm-hmm. How old are you, by the way?
I'm 26.
Okay, so at the young age of 26, you've accomplished all this. Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get into politics? What got you interested?
I'm happy to. I didn't grow up particularly political. I was born in India, but I moved to the United States when I was 3 months old. Moved to Lexington, Kentucky, and then I moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, then LA, then Seattle, then LA again, then Atlanta, a different place in Atlanta. I moved back to India for 3 years for my 8th, 9th, and 10th grade, and then I moved to Dallas, Texas, and then went to university in Austin, at UT Austin. And I was going to be a good Indian boy. I was going to get a medical degree. I was going to go be a doctor. That was the plan. When I started in college, I was studying biochemistry at UT Austin. And my freshman year summer was the summer of 2015, or 2016, actually. And that means that I was watching the presidential election going on. And I became fascinated with politics. It was so interesting. Donald Trump was running, Bernie Sanders was running, Hillary Clinton, Ted Cruz, all this stuff was going on. And it was just electric. And I knew I had to get involved somehow. So I ended up taking off the second semester of my sophomore year of college to work full-time in the Texas legislature, which is a big, highly involved legislature, 150 state house members, 31 state senators. The state senators represent over 1 million people. They have a staff of 8 to 10 people, very developed lobby ecosystem, big media infrastructure. It is a fully developed, it's a level of sophistication of a small to medium-sized European state. It's big politics. And I became convinced when I was there. I worked for a very conservative state senator that was also very effective at getting legislation passed. I became convinced that politics was much more about the people who you'll never vote for, who you'll never see on television, who you can never write a check to, than anything else. The staff, the bureaucrats behind the scenes, the people who work for the politicians, the people who staff administrative agencies. I just became obsessed with this question, and I ended up briefly considering getting a PhD in political science in order to study it. But I'm so glad I didn't do that. Instead, I became a practitioner. I ended up being the youngest chairman ever of a youth organization called Young Conservatives of Texas. That was sort of the only state-level political youth organization left in America. Most of them had become very federalized. And it was the oldest youth organization in Texas as well. And we had a great time. We doubled the size of the organization, had student chapters around the state, got legislation passed at the state capitol about campus free speech. We primaried weak conservatives and got good conservatives elected. And really, I got my arms around all the different kind of elements of politics and policy and how it's implemented. And I thought, that's it. I've done my job here. I'm ready to kick up my feet, retire, go to the private sector, and enjoy life. But then COVID hit. And, in COVID, I think everyone had a choice. They could either spend time thinking about what's next, or they could veg out on their couch watching television all day. And I'm very glad that I did the former. Then citizen and author J.D. Vance writes an article in April of 2020 talking about the infrastructure, political infrastructure that America First did not have during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and how we can win elections all the livelong day. But if we don't build that infrastructure, we will lose. And that was really interesting to me. One of the pieces he talked about in that article that released on a Wednesday in April of 2020 was personnel. These personnel at the federal level that undermine President Trump, that make congressmen weaker when they get elected. And I'm someone who sleeps very easily, but that night I couldn't fall asleep. I stayed up till 3:30 in the morning, and the only thing that let me fall asleep was I texted my now co-founders of my organization, and I said, we have to talk tomorrow, and we did, and we decided we would create American Moment with not $1 to the organization. No one had asked us to do this. We were wholly unqualified to do so. But hey, some of the best things in life are done that way, and the rest is, as they say, history.
So tell us a little more about American Moment. What is the mission?
Sure. There are 8,000 to 9,000 people working for House and Senate Republicans. These are the bicameral legislature in the United States. These are staffers that help with the policies and communications of these members. There are 4,800 staffers that the President of the United States gets to hire as political appointees that implement his agenda across the federal government. And there are a couple thousand positions in think tanks and public policy organizations and such that are influential. The universe of people that the right needs in order to effectively govern the country from Washington, D.C. is 15,000 people. American Moment's job is to identify, educate, and credential those 15,000 people, starting at the most junior levels, that have the following characteristics. One, they are fully committed to our worldview. It's the national conservative worldview. It's not the tired old Republican Party agenda of corporate tax cuts and endless wars abroad and weak on immigration. It recognizes that sovereignty is essential and that our immigration has to be controlled, that our foreign policy needs to be realist and restrained and sensible, and that trade policy and economics should be in service of the people, not in the service of the biggest corporations the world has ever seen. And that we have to fight. And so we pick people who have that worldview. We pick people who are highly competent and effective and intelligent, and people who are of good character. And essentially, once we found a person of that quality, it is white glove service. Whatever we need to do, move heaven and earth to make them as influential as humanly possible, get them to Washington, get them their first job, get them their second, third, fourth, and fifth job, and really trying to accelerate their careers so that they can become the next generation of chiefs of staff and assistant secretaries and secretaries of state and so on eventually, to make sure that when the American people elect patriotic, America first individuals to serve in elected office, that those people actually have the support they need in order to do their job well, and they don't get diluted and indoctrinated by a weak set of mediocre staffers that would prevent them from enacting that agenda.
Mm-hmm. Right. It seems like the left has a monopoly on these institutions of power in modern America, whether that be academia or mainstream media or federal bureaucracies. What explains how the left has been so successful at winning over institutions?
There is a big structural disparity that is at the heart of all of these problems in the United States, and I think across much of the Western world. If you are a talented, right-leaning person, you want to start a business. You want to go work in the private sector. You want to make something of yourself. You want to support your family. You want to have a family. Maybe you want to stay in the small town that you grew up in, or the medium town. Whereas if you're on the left of center, what is the highest and best good? Move to an urban area where power is centralized and get involved in bureaucratic institutions. Become overeducated. And so those 15,000 roles, there are probably 150,000 highly qualified, extremely intelligent people who made it their raison d'etre to get that minor role at the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. They have these extremely specific long-term goals that involve going into bureaucracies and owning them. And that applies to government, that applies to the civil service, that applies to corporate America now, that applies to the universities for sure, academic institutions, education, etc. The way that left-wingers self-actualize is by going into bureaucracies and owning them. The way that right-wingers self-actualize is by having families and building businesses. And so it's not a surprise that left-wingers have significantly overrepresented themselves in these important institutions of power. And part of the tactical evolution that right-wing movements across the world need to have is we need to become a lot more attentive to, appreciative of, and capable of, and willing to capture these bureaucracies back from the left.
Mm-hmm. And how optimistic are you that the right will be able to accomplish that? And what kind of time frame are we looking at here?
Anyone who thinks it's going to happen overnight is a fool. And, I would either heavily recalibrate your win condition or leave politics because you will be disappointed. Look, we're sitting here in the offices of MCC. It's organizations like MCC that are thinking on the time horizon at the resource scale to actually do something like this. It takes time. It takes generations to actually build capable right-wing cadres, patriotic cadres that are capable of leading nations. And so, I think we can we can make a big impact in 10 years. We can make a really big impact in 30 years is how we think about it in the United States. At the end of the day, we have a benefit, which is that we do have a lot of talented people. In fact, I would argue that right-wingers are probably on average more talented than left-wingers. The question is just realigning the incentives so that they can be put into the right places. The other thing is that on a purely secular basis, institutions are more naturally led by right-wingers than they are by left-wingers, because right-wingers believe in institutions pursuing goals and tactics aligned with their purpose and mission, whereas left-wingers are constantly trying to subvert institutional life to advance their ideological goals. And so it's always, they're trying to push a stone up a hill, whereas we're trying to let things be the way they are in a certain way. And so that doesn't mean that it is not a Sisyphean task to actually take these institutions back. That is the steepest hill to push a stone up that anyone will ever have. But what we actually want institutions to do is pretty straightforward, what they're meant to do. So I do think that there are some natural advantages that we have. I think also the global left has decided that reproducing is bad. And so their smartest people have no children, whereas our smartest people tend to have more children. So that's going to help us as well, I think. So there are headwinds, but again, it's going to take at least as long as it took them to take over the world for us to take it back.
Right. So Hungary has certainly garnered a lot of attention on the American right. Obviously, it's run by a conservative government, a conservative prime minister, Viktor Orban. What makes Hungary in particular so interesting to U.S. conservatives?
I think there is something particularly interesting about a Western country that doesn't hate itself. That's what it boils down to. This applies to Israel as well to some degree. Every Western nation has been overcome with this mind virus of constant racial self-flagellation, hatred of men, hatred of conventional families, hatred of prosperity, hatred of Western heritage, hatred of innovation. And to see a country where you can walk down the streets and there aren't brutalist concrete hellscapes on every corner, where public safety is upheld, where the people seem happy and normal, and that is actually economically thriving, is quite tempting. It's a little petri dish for us from an American vantage point of what is possible, what could be. Nice things are possible, because so much of the public policy consensus, right and left, for the last 50 years has been that change is impossible. All of the things that we complain about as conservatives are endemic to modernity, and you'd have to go back to the 12th century if you actually wanted to live in a normal place. And obviously that seems facially untrue, but it's tough when you don't have examples to point to. Think about the role that Sweden and Denmark play in the mental ecology of a left-winger. It's so useful for them. They get to point at a place and say, therefore goes democratic socialism. It can be done. It's nice and effective. And, obviously those things are sometimes slightly misconstrued, but it's so helpful to have an example for them of what winning would look like. And I think American conservatives love Hungary because it shows what winning could look like at every level, both in terms of what can be done socially and civilizationally, but also what can be done in terms of crafting a really, really competent, effective, winsome, and capable elite class that are just as competitive with the best of what any other country has to offer. The people I've met in the Hungarian diplomatic corps and part of institutions like MCC are A tier in terms of talent. And that's very impressive and difficult to get right. And so I think that's why we like it, is that it feels like an example of what can be. Is Hungary the United States? No. Is the challenges facing a 10 million person country in Europe the same as a 330 million intercontinental superpower? No. But I think that's the standard response that a lot of the anti-Hungary forces in the United States say, even on the right. And my answer is that just in the same way that in the United States we call the individual 50 states the laboratories of democracy, where interesting policy ideas can be executed at a small scale and then brought up to a big scale, I see Hungary as, from an American vantage point, as a great laboratory of democracy that shows that conservative democracy is possible and, frankly, looks pretty good when you implement it.
Yeah. What is your first impression of Hungary been? I know you've only been here for about a day.
But I arrived at 5 p.m. yesterday and went to go meet some friends for dinner. I walked over to dinner at 7 o'clock. It was still light out, and I thought, wow, everything's very pretty and nice and safe. And then I walked back from dinner at midnight, and I said, everything's pretty and nice and safe. And I can't say that about most Western cities. Washington, D.C. should be the most beautiful city in the entire world. It should be. It's the capital of the richest country the world has ever seen. And it has so much history and a great architectural tradition and so on. And a lot of it has modernist, brutalist architecture that's terrible. And then secondarily, a lot of it's dilapidated. And tertiarily, there's no public safety. So if I'm walking around at midnight in DC, I have a serious concern that I'm going to get shot or stabbed or robbed. And so it's a night and day difference. I think Budapest is what a capital should be in so many ways, which is it calls its people to a higher plane. It says, this is excellence incarnate. At least the parts I've been in. I'm sure that, like any place, there's more rundown neighborhoods and less ones, but Washington D.C. doesn't do that, and very few Western capitals do that. I was just in London. London does not do that. Brussels certainly does not do that. Paris is in shabby shape these days, as is Rome. A lot of these Western capitals are just decayed in a really embarrassing way. And so, wandering around here, I was like, this feels like a normal place and a normal time. And that's very special.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I think the left does better than the right is build international networks, build connections overseas. So you were at the National Conservatism Conference this past week, and will you be at CPAC Hungary this coming week?
No, unfortunately, I have to get back to the States.
Okay, but you're here in Hungary, here at MCC, building contacts in Europe. Why is it important for conservatives to build these networks of international cooperation as well?
Absolutely. So there was a cover of The Economist magazine a couple of weeks ago, and it was a red hat styled after the MAGA hat. And it said, make blank great again. And blank was a list of like 10 countries. It said, make Hungary, Italy, El Salvador, Israel great again. And I thought that was quite right. And I think the subtitle for the cover was Meet the Global Anti-Globalist Alliance or something like that. Look, at the end of the day, left-wing tactics are highly sophisticated. They derived enormous strength over the course of the last 100 years from building international networks where they could learn from each other, support each other, and draw prestige, influence, and power from. When the era of globalization really kicked off in an intense way, there were some right-wingers that tried to do the same, but they were seeking the same acidifying, globalizing pressure on their home countries as the left was. They just wanted a slightly different flavor of globalism with the lower taxes. And so the first instinct for sovereigntist movements would be to say, we're not going to participate in this internationalism. We're going to stick to what we want to do at home. But here's the problem. Anti-globalist movements often have talent issues. They have tactical inexperience, and in general, they get rolled very easily. And so what is the point of the global anti-globalist alliance? It's so that we can learn from each other. We can learn the tactics that each nation is using to fight back against our left. We can compare notes on how their left has sought to undermine them. We can anticipate tactics right on the horizon. I'm talking to a lot of Poles right now because you want to see what imperial leftism implemented at the point of a gun looks like. It's what Donald Tusk is doing in Poland right at this very moment. On the positive side, what Hungary is doing is very interesting. El Salvador decided that crime was going to be illegal again, and it's a safe place to be now. There's just so much to learn. And there's something else, right, which is we have to be realists about human nature. In a global, interconnected world, the blank slate, ambitious, talented young person, they feel the draw of the skies and the seas. They want to see the world. They want to feel like they're part of something beyond just their nation. And so the left was able to draw on that desire to great effect, to attract, that kind of middle third of elites that could either be right wing or left wing. They were able to become a very compelling option for that person who just has that wanderlust. If we build a global anti-globalist alliance, we could solve that problem for the right. Hey, it's okay, right winger who's doing great work for his people in Argentina. There's a great network of allied conservatives for you to meet in the United States and in Italy and in London and in Budapest. And you can sort of enjoy the benefits of feeling like you are part of something bigger than yourself and bigger than your home nation, while still primarily having an allegiance to your home nation. It's extremely potent from a sociological perspective and essential, I think, if we're going to win.
Mm-hmm. As a man with your finger on the pulse of American youth conservatism, where is the energy today? What types or what flavors of conservatism really have a lot of traction with young Americans?
It's a good question. One of the core concepts I think about a lot in the United States is that the process by which one gets politically activated at any age it's almost like carbon dating. Like it's a moment frozen in time. If someone got politically activated in 2011, what do I know about them? They might have gotten politically activated because President Obama had just passed the Affordable Care Act, and they thought the federal government was subverting the American healthcare system, and they were really activated to fight government overreach into healthcare. That person is going to have one set of instincts, priorities, commitments. And if there had been a different primary news cycle, overarching narrative at that point in time, a different kind of person would have been activated. Or the terms of the same person's activation would be different. The terms of activation for young people right now is basically President Trump. It's either you got activated like I did, 2015-16, by his revolutionary campaign. You saw him get rolled during his administration. You saw a Biden administration completely undo the every good thing that the Trump administration had ever done, and its excitement and preparedness for him to return to office. With him comes the ideas that he championed, the national conservative ideas of economic nationalism, foreign policy restraint, immigration restrictionism, bulldog approach to left-wing institutions, whether it's the media or what have you, a kind of pugnacious tenacity and a willing to fight back. That's what excites and vivifies you. And so almost every single young person I meet is orders of magnitude more of a national conservative and willing to fight than their corresponding activated young people would have been 30 years ago. So I have plenty of people to help in my day job get involved because so many young people know that they're losing their country. The other thing I'll say is that young people that get activated now have exclusively lived under totalitarian left-wing rule in cultural institutions. They've attended, since they were kids, elementary, middle, high schools that are run by nagging far-left ideologues that hate every straight white male in the entire country. And so if you're a young straight white male, you are right wing. Like, it's very unlikely that you are at all tempted by the left, because the left has basically started speaking in almost genocidal rhetoric about you and has been your entire life. And so that's dangerous for the left, because they've basically created an entire population that is highly motivated to institute political change, and they'll be a big part of doing so.
And are you optimistic about youth in general in America? Do you have a sense that Gen Z might be shifting to the right or will as the years go forward?
It's hard to say. One of the core sort of mistakes that I think a lot of conservatives in the United States make is they get very starry-eyed at the thought of novel constituencies entering the Republican Party and the conservative movement. So whether it's a certain minority group or young people or what have you, it's very sexy, the thought that, oh my God, we're going to get young people to vote Republican, or we're going to get blacks or Hispanics or whatever to vote Republican. I have within me no shame that this is primarily an older white more rural party. That's okay with me. I like those people. I've never not liked those people. I used to hang out with them at local Tea Party meetings and such. And I'm not embarrassed by, straight white older people. One of the ways that I see how conservatism works in practice is that one version of conservatism is trying to protect permanent things, right? And so whether it's family or community or faith or nation, young people, especially in the West, if you're just graduated from college, you're not making a lot of money. You don't have a family. You don't own a home. You're not tied to any singular community. Why on earth, from a rational self-interest perspective, would you be conservative? And you could say, well, if you look to the future, it's more in their interest to be conservative. Young people don't look to the future very often. Their time horizons are always quite limited. And so what's important for right-wing movements is to realize that the process of making voters is the process of giving them permanent things to care about. And so it's really concerning if in the United States you see the trends that we do right now, which is that home ownership is plummeting, family formation is plummeting, people are not having children. People assume that, young people are liberal and old people are conservative. That is not a fact of nature. It is a fact of that process that I laid out, that they acquire more permanent things that they care about. It's possible that if we don't fix those things, like family formation and homeownership, that people will still become right wing, but I doubt it. I think it is the systemic threat to conservative political influence in the United States is we're creating a generation of people with no baked-in commitment to the civilization they live in because it has failed them. And so we have to solve these big, big, big endemic problems in the United States. Otherwise, totalitarian left-wing rule is the only way out.
Mm-hmm. Looking ahead to November, could you just briefly sketch out what you think a second Trump administration might look like?
It's going to be awesome.
And what would a second Biden administration look like?
I'll start with a second Biden administration. Actuarial tables are a fact of nature. President Biden's chances of dying sometime in a second term, purely based on the actuarial tables, I think adds up to something like 40% or something like that. It's really bad, and that's just on a pure assuming median health indicators, and I don't think he has median health indicators. I think he's potentially worse in some ways. So it wouldn't be President Biden the entire time. It'd be President Kamala Harris. She is an incredibly stupid far-left ideologue who is vindictive and is surrounded by people even more left-wing than her. It would be very bad for every conservative in the entire world if Kamala Harris became president. She's also not very bright, so she'd probably set the world on fire by accident. It would just be an absolute disaster. I think that if President Biden wins re-election, the gloves are off. Every single far left idea they have cooking up is on the table, and they will very aggressively pursue an agenda that probably resembles what they're doing in Poland or in any other country where a left wing party with an axe to grind really wants to implement it. I think that you'll start to see political persecution expand. I think they'll almost certainly imprison President Trump if Joe Biden's reelected. They'll certainly try to impoverish him. And a lot more conservatives are going to be significantly damaged because if I'm the left in that moment, I see, oh my goodness, we just won by the skin of our teeth. We need to restack the deck of power in the United States to ensure permanent rule. And they will do that. And they will be significantly injurious to the right of center. If President Trump wins, I think we have an opportunity. It's only 4 years, but I think that President Trump could dramatically reorient how the American people see their political system. Joe Biden is the last normal person the Democrats are going to nominate for president for a long time. He's from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He's an old white guy. He puts on his aviators. He says, look, Jack, he seems like your grandpa. He's a little old and senile, but he's your grandpa. After him, it's one freak show after another. The full consequences of the left's, hatred of success of whites, of straight people, of men. It'll all just become a giant identity politics festival, and they're going to foist one crazy person after another on the national stage, hoping that they catch on. It's not going to be pretty. What President Trump has the opportunity to do is to contrast that freak show with an effective national conservative agenda implemented, and the training up of a successor generation to him that will be a very, very, very compelling political alternative to the left of center. I think that if President Trump wins, I'd put it more likely that Republicans have control for 12 years than they do for 4. I think that if he wins, there's a good chance that a Republican would win the White House again in 4 years, and that we would get 12 years to do long-term reform along the lines of what Hungary has been able to do in the second Orban government. And if we do that, then I think America has a chance to keep its place in the world, to be a relevant power, and not a declining one, and to enjoy real prosperity, cultural solidarity, and growth. But if Biden wins, all of that is in trouble.
One final question before we wrap up. What would you recommend to a young conservative who wants to shape his country?
There will be plenty of options for things that you can do, young conservative, that will be more lucrative, that will be less stressful, that will be more socially acceptable, and that will be easier. Don't do that. 20 years ago, the choice of whether or not to get involved in politics for a young conservative was a prudential one. It was an easy one. It was like, if I want to make money, don't need to get involved in politics, I can come back later. Politics is now, in the Western world, for a young conservative, existential. Every nation is making a choice right now whether to commit national suicide or not. The luxury of doing something else is no longer available to the vast majority of young people. Whatever gains you might have, I tell people you can go work your private equity job and then retire to a sweet potato farm and have 3 kids, but Kamala Harris will still show up to your door with a syringe of hormones for your 7-year-old to turn them trans. There is no escape. This left is imperial. They will not let you carve out any small space in society where they do not control things. They will insinuate themselves into the most private parts of your life and destroy you if you do not obey them. This era is essentially a prolonged battle between forces that want to live in normal, thriving civilization and forces that want to destroy it. So there isn't a formal draft, but consider this the draft. You have to get involved in the fight in some way. Find wherever your highest and best talents are and become as effective, capable as possible. Find some allies and comrades that can be in this fight with you. And it'll be fairly straightforward, difficult but straightforward, to take back the Western world from these civilizational arsonists. But make no mistake, you don't exactly have a choice.
Saurabh Sharma, thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.